Just while we're waiting for the final audios to connect, a massive hello to all of you from myself, Sarah Gordon, and all of the Satala team who are going to be running this very interactive 55-minute session over the course of the next hour. For those of you who haven't used Zoom before, congratulations, you've managed to avoid a pretty big feat over the last 9 months. But just so that you're aware, down at the bottom of your screen over at the left-hand side, you've got your mute button and your camera button, so you can switch that on and off. We would ask you to try and stay on mute for the majority of the session today. Also as well, in the middle of your screen, you'll see that there's a little chat box. So if you want to open that up, we will be encouraging you to submit ideas, suggestions and questions to us through the chat during the course of the entire session. So what are we going to talk through today? We're going to have a little look at how big is your risk appetite, especially with regards to making difficult decisions in high stress situations. We're going to take a look at what do we actually mean by risk appetite and tolerance. We're going to take a look at some case studies, and we're going to finish by attempting to complete a tool altogether, which may or may not work depending on our technology. I'm just going to unmute myself. Somebody just muted me, which was exciting. So, okay, with regards to our session today, how big is your appetite? And I think we'll have more people joining us as we go into the session, which is just brilliant. So to start with, ladies and gentlemen, your first challenge is to attempt to use Mentimeter. If Mentimeter isn't your bag, that is okay. Use chat instead. And what we'd like you to do is to go to www.menti.com, enter the code 8270414, and you will be confronted with your first question. And your first question is, how big is your risk appetite for traveling today? Okay, so we're asking you about, would you like to get on an aeroplane or a boat and travel internationally today? If the answer is absolutely yes, I've got nothing to worry about, then tell us. If the answer is absolutely not, I'm in lockdown and have been for the last 9 months, then tell us that. So what is your appetite for traveling today? So I'm going to let Ellen share her screen. And excellent, we've got a bit of a mixture of a response coming in, which is great. Do feel free to enter your ideas into chat if you would like instead, if that's better for you. But what we're beginning to see here, which is absolutely fantastic, is that we're getting a bit of a mixture. And that was fantastic there. I'm sure that some of you are still entering into Mentimeter, and don't worry about that. We will be collecting the results later and we can share them with you afterwards. But what we were seeing there was that some people were saying, yes, please. And other people were saying, absolutely not. And I think we had one person who was sitting quite happily in the middle. And the reason why we get this diversity of results when we pose questions like this is because every single one of us has a slightly different predisposition to taking risk. Also, every single one of us are living and surviving in very different contexts. For those of you who might be in Australia, a massive round of applause and congratulations for managing to conquer that COVID and get those numbers down to as low as possible. And so therefore, of course, being able to travel around Australia, etc., is totally fine. Whereas for those of us who are here in Europe, so I'm currently speaking to you from Scotland in the UK, for those of us here in Europe, traveling at the moment is probably not a very good idea because we know that that's going to lead to all kinds of trouble. So when we're talking about risk appetite, we need to be aware that every single one of us has our own personal appetite for risk, and that's going to be different depending on who we are, our life experience, where we are in the world. And our appetite is all about how much risk are we willing to take. But when we take this concept of risk appetite and tolerance into our teams, our organizations, our businesses, etc., then it becomes a little bit more tricky, because now we're trying to understand what is the appetite of the collective, what is the appetite of the team. And so that therefore drills really deeply into culture and what is it that we're actually trying to do as an organization. And so a much more difficult question for us to try and answer is actually, what is the appetite of our team with regards to traveling today? We can make decisions for ourselves, but when it comes to operating as a unit, how do we make sure that everybody is aligned? Everybody understands, okay, which direction are we going in? And what is our tolerance thresholds with regards to veering off slightly from that path? So what I'm describing here is this concept of risk appetite and tolerance, which is used all around the world across different sectors to help us manage those risks in an aligned manner. So taking a step back and thinking about appetite and tolerance as a whole, if we were to imagine that we have lots of different risks in our risk universe, and of course you can scope your risk universe in any which way you like, within that universe of risks, there will be some risks that you want to take. Now, if you are a business, those are the risks that might give you a competitive advantage over your peers, or they might just be inherent to the activities that you are doing, okay? So there will always be some risks that you are willing to take. Around the outside of that, we have a zone of tolerance. And in our zone of tolerance are an array of risks that we might not necessarily want to take, but we can take them. So we can accept those risks, okay? Also, in many cases, we can do something about those risks. So with controls and with management, we can move them around. Now, the outside of that risk tolerance zone is something called our risk capacity, okay? And what we mean by our risk capacity is that tipping point beyond which we don't really want to go. Or if we go out beyond that risk capacity, then our organization will either have gone bust, okay, or will cease to exist, or we need to change our strategy. We need to change something really fundamental about what it is that our organization does. Now, with regards to this terminology that I'm using here, many organizations use the same words to mean something slightly different. So one of the big confusion points with regards to risk appetite and tolerance is people not really understanding what's meant. And I think every organization that I've had the luxury of working with over the last few decades has used these words in slightly different ways. But for the purposes of today, risk appetite, that is the risk that we are willing to take. Risk tolerance, or that zone of tolerance, these are the risks that we can take. And that risk capacity, that's your tipping point beyond which you don't want to go. And so if somebody's asking that question, how much risk is too much risk? That's the tipping point that they're trying to get to there. And that is the risk capacity. Now, in terms of this diagram here, sometimes we call this the solar system diagram. Others like to think of this as being a fried egg diagram. You can see that we've offset that risk appetite circle slightly so that the zone of tolerance on one side has a very narrow zone, and on the other side of the risk tolerance zone, you've got a very much wider area there. And that's to try and depict the fact that for some risks that you need to be able to tolerate in pursuit of your activities, you will try and have a very, very narrow zone of tolerance. So things like health and safety, bribery and corruption, things like that. Those are the sorts of risks that we try to manage to the lowest level of tolerance possible, okay? Within health and safety, we sometimes call this to as low as reasonably practicable. And there's a load of other language that people tend to use with regards to that. However, there will be other risks for which you'll be very, very happy to leave a much larger degree of wiggle room or tolerance in which they can exist. So, for example, if you have a project, it's very normal to ensure that you have, say, a 20% contingency in your budget for the delivery of that project. And that's you introducing tolerance into that area of risk. Okay, so what this means is that when you're thinking about your risk profile for your organization or for a particular project or a task, you will have some risks that you want to control really tightly, and you'll have other risks that you're quite happy to relax and give them a much larger degree of tolerance. So it's all very well drawing circles on bits of paper, etc., but how do we actually make this mean something? How do we allow people to know where those trigger points are for when they need to take action or when they can leave things be? Well, this is when we start to really work out, okay, if we're looking at a certain area of risk, we can say, on one hand, what is our best case scenario for this area? And on the other hand, what is our worst case scenario? And what that's doing is that's giving us two bookends within which will then sit our appetite and our tolerance. Because after that, we can then say, okay, what is our appetite? What is our zone of tolerance? And then what's that tipping point? What's that criteria? And by breaking our risks out into this, we can then begin to understand and say, okay, I now understand why you think it's so important that we all stay in lockdown at the moment with regards to COVID-19. And we begin to understand where those sliding scales are and decision points with regards to those risks, depending on how our context is changing. And of course, as we've seen over the last little while, what we can begin to build up from that are these trigger action response plans, okay, where we might go through different levels or different tiers with regards to, okay, our context is now saying that the number of cases of COVID in our particular region has reached this particular level, that therefore induces this type of action. And this is very, very common around the world, and it's all based on risk appetite and tolerance. So it's a very, very common tool to be using when we're trying to manage our risks. So if I now dive into a few little case studies, and there are so many case studies we could go through here. In fact, in the Satala team behind the scenes, we had a lot of debate with regards to which case studies to share with you, because we've had a really, really fascinating few years of working with lots of different organizations all around the world. So the case studies that we've got for you, we've got one to do with football or soccer, i.e. the form of football with a round ball. As you can probably tell from my accent, I'm in the UK, so it pains me to call this soccer. We're also going to talk through an example to do with safety, which of course can be applied to any form of heavy industry, but it's also equally applicable to those organizations who go to fairly exciting regions where people might be encountering big scary hazards, etc. Talking about big scary hazards, we've also got an example from banking, and then finally we're going to finish off with an example from government. So with regards to football or soccer, if we imagine that our country is playing a big football match, it might be part of the World Cup, it might be something different. Just looking at this picture now, it looks really strange, doesn't it? Seeing thousands of people crammed together in a stadium. But this picture wasn't taken that long ago, really. So when we're talking about soccer, if I move beyond COVID-19 for a second, what we can begin to think about is, okay, so let's imagine that our football team is in, I don't know, the semi-finals of the World Cup. Now, what is the best case scenario and what is the worst case scenario that could happen to our national football team at this point in time? Well, the best case scenario is that we win the game without even having to turn up. That would be just glorious. It would be a bit boring, to be honest, but that means that we're effectively getting a pass straight into the final of the World Cup. So that would be the best case scenario. The worst case scenario, and I think we can probably think of a number of different worst case scenarios here, but the worst case scenario, I suspect, would be that we get disqualified. Okay, and if our team were disqualified, we would be disgraced, we would probably lose our funding, we might be fined, our public would ridicule us for not being a good enough football team, perhaps players don't want to play for us, and actually there might be a bigger impact, which are health problems within our country, because nobody wants to go and play football or soccer, okay, because they're so disappointed in their national team. And of course, in this worst case scenario, of course, we're losing the match and we're not advancing to that World Cup final. So you can see now how we've got a best case scenario and a worst case scenario. So we've got those two bookends. Now we want to work out, okay, so between those two bookends, what is our risk appetite? So how much risk are we willing to take? What is that zone of tolerance, which then comes to that tipping point or that criteria, which says, okay, we're willing to take all of this risk up until a point. What is that point? So if we start to zoom in on that and we say, okay, let's start with our risk appetite. Well, our risk appetite is, you know what, we don't necessarily need to just be handed that free pass into the final of the World Cup. We're happy to work for that. And actually, we are willing to accept the risk of having to play football for 90 minutes. Okay, we are willing to accept that. However, we don't really want anybody to be injured. Okay, and we don't really want any yellow or red cards, because we want to have all of our players available for the final of the World Cup. And also we don't want to be embarrassed by bad behavior or something like that. Okay, so last time I checked, the way that you win a football match is you score more goals than the other team. I'm just going to check that with Ollie, Ellen and Norm. Yep, they're nodding at me. Excellent. So I've understood the rules of football. So if I'm saying my risk appetite is basically to win the match without getting any injuries or any yellow or red cards. So that's our risk appetite. We are willing to accept the risks associated with that. If I go to the other end of the scale and I say, well, what's that tipping point? What's that risk capacity? What's the amount of tolerance I'm willing to go up to, but not beyond? So with regards to this football match, our tipping point is winning the match and losing the match. So how badly can we do in this particular game of football right up until the point when we lose the game? Okay, so that is the tipping point that we're now trying to describe. And so because, of course, if we lose the match, then we're out of the tournament and we don't have a chance of winning the World Cup. Whereas we can tolerate playing football beyond 90 minutes. So we can tolerate going into extra time. We can tolerate penalties, as painful as they are to a nation. We can actually tolerate lots of injuries. We can tolerate that. And we can tolerate as many red or yellow cards as you can throw at us. Okay, because what we're trying to do here is to get into the final of the World Cup. So what we've now managed to do is delineate that zone of tolerance, okay, from winning the match in 90 minutes with no cards and no injuries, all the way through to struggling through extra time and penalties, yellow cards, red cards, injuries, you name it, but we've still won the match. And so therefore we've managed to get into that World Cup final. We're now establishing where we are happy or where we can exist with regards to managing those risks. And of course, we can now dream up lots of different indicators or criteria that help us to indicate or work out where are we in that trajectory of risk. So for example, every time the opposition scores a goal, we're tracking more towards our risk capacity. Every time we score a goal, we're going more towards our risk appetite. If one of our players gets hurt, we're going in the wrong direction. If their players get hurt, as evil as this sounds, actually we're going in the right direction. Okay, and so on and so forth. So you can begin to see how you structure really simply risk appetite, risk tolerance, and that criteria that can sit in the middle of that. So that is our example, a very simple example taken from soccer. And yes, we could, of course, apply this to many large football leagues around the world that we actually have the luxury of working with, which is very exciting. So how about changing tact a little bit? How about we take a little look at safety? Okay, because safety is really interesting because so many organizations have this concept or this term of zero tolerance for harm. Now, is that possible? Truly possible when we're thinking about appetite and tolerance? Or is it just a really nice vision that we can move towards? Now, personally, I'm a geologist originally, and I've spent a huge amount of time working in different sectors, such as the mining sector. And so within mining, having scenes like this photograph that you can see in the back here of lots of hard hats, etc. Usually, of course, they're on the heads of people. This is very, very common because it's a very hazardous industry and people, unfortunately, do get hurt a lot. And so as a result, trying to work out what is our appetite and tolerance with regards to safety is really important. It's a really important thing that we can do. So what we might say here, and I'd welcome your comments coming in on chat as well, because what I'm about to say may be quite emotive, but I welcome your comments in your chat. So best case scenario, no matter what industry or what project we're doing or where in the world we're working, best case scenario is nobody gets hurt. Worst case scenario, very simply, everybody gets hurt. Okay, so this is a really easy couple of bookends that we can put in place there. However, zooming in on this, our risk appetite, we might say again, zero harm, nobody gets hurt. Our vision and our appetite is that nobody gets hurt. Whereas when we track out to our tolerance, this is much more difficult, because what we're saying here is, in, say, a mining environment, if you are actively putting people in dangerous situations, can your tolerance for somebody being hurt really be zero, as we so often say? Or actually, is it this thing called as low as reasonably practicable? And the key thing here is that a LARP, or as low as reasonably practicable, is not zero. So if it's not zero, what is it? And it's at this point in time here where leaders and decision makers find this question very, very difficult. Because what they say is, well, actually, how much harm are we willing to allow to happen in the pursuit of what we're trying to do? And this is a case where it doesn't matter if you are a charity providing aid to people who may have been caught up in a typhoon or an earthquake, all the way through to something like oil and gas. It is the same conundrum that we face. How much safety risk are we willing to tolerate? And the more honest we can be about that, the easier it is to plan for and to control for. Whereas if we just say zero, we all know that that's not true. And so we need to work out what that tipping point is. Some organizations say that they want to be 20% better than last year, whatever that means. And I've seen that happen a lot. But this is something where ideally we can have a much more mature conversation about that tipping point that we have there. Once we establish that, we can then use some of our normal metrics to say, okay, well, where are we on that spectrum? And with regards to safety, we can use leading indicators such as how many high potential hazards have we spotted in this particular area? How many high potential incidents might there have been? A high potential incident being something that has occurred but nobody got hurt. So those might be sort of leading indicators that we might look at, opposed to lagging indicators, which are of course far worse, because a lagging indicator within health and safety generally tells us about people who have been hurt, okay? And that might be an incident, or in the worst situation, it may of course be a fatality. So there are lots of different data sets, for example, that we can use here. Now, just diving into the nuances of health and safety, risk appetite and tolerance, what we often find here is that some organizations will say, okay, we could have risk tolerance of C, B, or A, of course, and as we're going towards our risk appetite, we're getting better and better in terms of that performance that we're expecting. And what you find is some organizations say that their tolerance is A, but then when you do the analysis of their data, they're actually sitting outside of that tolerance zone, which is an indicator to say that they are out of control with regards to the management of those safety risks. And that is massively important, because being out of control is a trigger for immediate escalation to senior decision makers to say, we're no longer within the boundaries that you have predetermined for us. We need to make a plan and do it now, okay? Because otherwise things are just going to spiral out of control. So that's a little case study from the world of safety. I'm now going to shift gear and I'm going to go from safety to banking. It's not often I think you do that particular order of events. I'm going to go through banking and then I'm going to open up for a bit of an interactive exercise, because we're actually going to try and do one of these best case scenarios, worst case scenarios, appetite and tolerance exercises for going back to the office. Okay, so I'd like you guys to be thinking in the back of your mind, okay, if I had to design this for my company, for my office, what would this look like for me, and how can I use that to help me make decisions? So banking, back in 2008, something happened and that was the global financial crisis, which now on a scale compared to COVID doesn't look like it was that big a deal. But basically back then it was, and as a result of basically lots of people being caught cheating, which effectively was one of the contributing factors to that financial meltdown, the regulators that tend to try and look after banking put a whole load of additional regulations in place. One of which was that banks had to go and create a risk culture, and that should be supported by the drafting and the publishing of risk appetite statements. So being very rude about banks, and I don't really mean this, of course, they all went, great, where can we buy a culture from? Of course, it's more complicated than that. But what we found was actually one of the very practical tools to be able to steer that culture and create the culture within the banking environment was to say what is appropriate and what is not appropriate in terms of different activities, different tasks, different risks that could be undertaken. And what that allowed us to do, and you can see it in the little cross diagram here, is to enable people to acknowledge risks that before had been unacknowledged or had been hidden somewhere within the organization. And that was really important, because the more unacknowledged risks you have, the more surprises you're going to have as an organization. And so therefore, the more uncertainty you're going to experience and the less control you're going to be in. So within banking, they started to put in place risk appetite and tolerance statements. There's a very strict regulations around how this is done. But basically, when it comes down to it, within banking, we have a certain array of risks, such as fraud, which is an area of risk that you want to manage very, very carefully. You want to try and reduce that down to as close to zero as possible, all the way through liquidity, business continuity, project risk, etc. Okay, so there are lots of different areas of risk. With regards to each of these primary areas of risk, and again, there's lots of terminology we can use here, what organizations started to do is say, okay, best case scenario, worst case scenario, appetite, tolerance, and how do we measure all of the stuff in between? And so it's exactly the same flow that banks started to use that have been going on in the world of, say, health and safety, project risk management, etc., for many, many years. But it was being used to try and steer some of the cultural factors by saying there are some risks that we just will not tolerate. So if you are operating outside of that zone, then we need to do something very, very fast to bring you back in control again. And what you can see here are some ideas of different metrics, etc., that could be used. Now, I know, because seeing all your lovely names that are coming up on Zoom at the moment, that some of you work in banking. And so you guys will be able to tell me the story about this in far more eloquent terms. But the really great thing that has been happening is that the regulators, by putting in the requirement to have risk appetite and tolerance statements, what they gave to banking was a practical way of being able to drive that risk culture within the business, rather than just leaving it at, you need a risk culture, because that is something that is very, very difficult just to go away and create. So we've been going for almost half an hour now. Who would have thought? We're having so much fun. And we've done 3 of our 4 case studies. As promised, what we're now going to do is we're going to do a little exercise. And what we will distribute after we finish today's session is a little fact sheet that looks like this over on the right-hand side, which just describes some of what we've been talking through over the last 30 minutes or so. And then also as well, it contains this template on the back of the fact sheet. And what you have here is just best case, worst case, appetite, capacity, and then some of those tolerance metrics along the bottom. So in order to do this, ladies and gentlemen, we can either use chat or you can go into our Mentimeter again. So yes, time to get out those phones or those computers, which I suspect you have to hand, seeing as you're watching this Zoom meeting now. So please go to menti.com again, type in the same code as you had before. If you've still got it open, great, you're ahead of the game. And what we're going to talk about is, let's imagine that as a collective organization, we all work for the same company, and our head office is in London, so in London, UK. And prior to lockdown, which happened towards the beginning of March in the UK, this is what that particular office looked like, okay, in slightly different forms. As soon as we went into lockdown, this is what the office looked like. So there was a very quick pivot to push everything online. And of course, the question now is, given that our head office is in the middle of London, when should we go back to that office? When should we go back to that office? So Ellen, if you can just wrestle control again in terms of the screen sharing, what we're going to ask you to do is in Mentimeter, using the word cloud, is to type in there some ideas as to what is the best case scenario for returning to the office. Okay, so best case scenario, exactly as we're seeing appearing there. So everybody feels safe, everybody is comfortable, there's no COVID, okay, there's a cure for COVID. Perhaps we wake up and we realize it was all just a bad dream, okay, the health systems work, global herd immunity, etc. So this is a case here where we go, yes, we've solved it, it's amazing. Okay, so we're beginning to articulate or to describe what is the best case scenario for returning to the office. Okay, so that's the great, the optimistic side of things, which is brilliant. Now let's go to the other end of the scale. What about the other end of the scale? And Ellen, if we can move on to the next question. What is the worst case scenario for returning to the office? So you guys will now need to click to the next question in your Mentimeter and start typing in, what is the worst case scenario for returning to the office? What do you think this might look like? And if you can't get into that bit on Mentimeter, then feel free to type into chat what you think we might need there. So yeah, worst case scenario, people feeling forced. Perhaps there's no cure. Perhaps, and this is really horrific, perhaps COVID mutates far enough away so that the vaccines that we've managed to invent don't work. Okay, perhaps it's dangerous. We might be the vaccine is ineffective, etc. So lots and lots of really good descriptions going on here, which, as much as we don't want to think about them, we have to be able to think about these as well. So what we're beginning to articulate are best case scenario, worst case scenario. Virus in the third wave. No. Okay, Ellen, we need to go to the next one before we all get too depressed about what's going on here. Okay, so now we're looking at our appetite. So remember, the best case scenario was that we're all cured, there's global herd immunity, etc., which, yes, would be absolutely brilliant. But now let's rein it in a little bit and say, actually, what kind of risk would we be willing to accept? What kind of things do we need in place to allow us to go back to that office? So we've got safe work. Perhaps this is something where, social distancing. So within the office environments, we've actually set up the office so that you can work 2 meters away from all of your colleagues. You've thought about, how do people go to the bathroom? How do people store their bikes if they have cycled into work? How does all of that work? Also as well, how do we travel into the office in a safe environment? If your office is in the middle of London, the scary environment, the dangerous environment, is not necessarily inside the office, i.e. an environment you can control. It is what's going on outside the office. Are people going to have to get on the London Underground to get to work? Intentionally getting in a confined space where you will be breathing in air and particles from other people. What kind of things do we need to think about there? And also as well, maybe perhaps people have all had the vaccination or whatever might be going on. So this is fantastic. We're getting some really great ideas for what kind of risk might we be willing to take with regards to this. Ellen, if we can now go to that capacity or that tipping point. So on to the next question here. So what is that tipping point? So how much risk is too much risk, or kind of what is that tipping point? That's what we're looking at now. So yes, if we can make sure that there definitely is social distancing, etc., that's the kind of risk that we're willing to take. What now is the tipping point? Now, bearing in mind, your tipping point might be very, very close to your risk appetite, or it might be quite a long way away, depending on what you think is most appropriate for the organization at hand. So this might be something here where, you might have children at home I could interpret this in a number of ways, but what this might be doing is it's preventing you from actually doing any work. Okay, so therefore you need to be able to get out of the house. And yeah, we've got poor mental health. I think one of the aspects of COVID-19 and the situation that it has caused is significant stress on people's mental well-being. At what point in time does it become more dangerous for somebody to stay at home versus be exposed to COVID-19? And that's almost part of the tipping point that we're beginning to look at here. And whilst an employer is not responsible for absolutely everything to do with an employee, we do have a duty of care to make sure that all of those individuals are okay. So that's a case there where at what point in time do we need to go into the office? And we have things here like access to office hardware. So you might have computers running in the office that every so often they might crash. And so we need to go in and we need to reboot those computers, for example. So someone has to physically go into the office. Wi-Fi overload at home. Yes, I think most of us have now got to know our router boxes, etc., incredibly well, and knowing at what point in time do they need to be reset so that we have good quality internet, so that we can carry on working in as normal a manner as possible, albeit over Zoom or Teams or any of the other tools that we might have. So this is something here where, again, what we're beginning to articulate is, okay, that appetite, okay, how much risk are we willing to take? And then that zone of tolerance out to that tipping point. And knowing what that tipping point looks like and communicating that to the rest of the team is one of the most important things you can do, because it allows them a degree of certainty, and it means that we can therefore plan. Now, this is one of the things, depending on which country, of course, you've been trapped in, shall we say, over the last 9 months. Some governments have been really, really good at managing people's expectations by saying this risk is too much risk, this one we can accept. And other governments have been changing their minds continuously. Now, it's quite all right to change your mind if the context is changing. What is frustrating for many people and then causes people to go and do their own thing and not necessarily obey the rules is if they've got no idea what the rules really are, or they've got no idea where those predetermined tipping points are that can be set by the government. So all of this great information that you've been giving to us here, we will be disseminating this or making this available for you if you want to use it in any of your own work as well. So thank you very much for that, Ellen. What you can then go on to, of course, is you can begin to work out what is the distinct criteria through which you can measure where are you on that scale between appetite and that tipping point. So you can therefore measure, are we getting better or are we getting worse? And I don't know, Ellen, if you have those final slides or not. It's okay if we don't, but if you do, you guys will have access to it in Mentimeter, and feel free to fill that in your own time. So you can see there on the screen, Ellen is sharing it, and you guys are more than welcome to fill that in behind the scenes. Well, what I'm going to do now, I'm going to wrestle back control of the slides, and please do feel free to send in your comments and your questions on the chat as we go through our next case study and into the final sections of today's session, because we do, of course, welcome your comments, ideas, etc. So what we've been doing is we've been filling in this map or this framework, which allows us not only to understand ourselves, what is our appetite and tolerance for something, but also communicate that with other people and begin to bring in some data. Okay, so we can understand what is going on here. Now, just while Ellen types some of that up so we can share it with you, I've got one final case study to go through, and this is it's a government or it's a public body example. So you can see Big Ben or the tower that houses Big Ben in the background. Actually, in the UK, Big Ben has been shrouded in scaffolding pretty much since May 2016, which was round about the time of the Brexit vote. So I'm looking forward to seeing what this tower is going to look like after the UK has exited Europe. I don't know if there's a correlation. Maybe there is, maybe there isn't. But with regards to Brexit, What that's meant within the UK and within public organisations in the UK is that everybody's had to relook at the strategy and the purpose of their organisations, because what they now need to do is say, what do we look like as Britain on a global scale rather than a component of Europe? And no matter what we emotionally feel about Brexit, this is just something that we've had to get on with. And so what you have on the left-hand side of this slide are a series of typical strategic objectives, for example, that a public body may well have in the UK. And of course, you've got things like being ready to meet our operational commitments, so actually do our jobs. That's always a good one. Make sure we've got a workforce which is fit for the future. Perhaps we need to make sure that we're up to date, if not leading, with regards to the technology that we use. We need to be ready for global Britain rather than part of Europe, Britain. And of course, we always need to be able to operate and act safely and professionally. So what we can do with this, and you'll see that I've gone back to our little solar system diagram, is we can take those objectives or those areas of risk and we can plot them up in that zone of tolerance. So we say, depending on that objective, how much risk are we willing to associate with that objective? How much risk can we take? And number 5, that was the operating safely. So you can see that there's very little tolerance round about number 5, whereas things like number 2, so having a fit workforce, or number 1, being ready to meet our operational commitments, in this particular exercise that was done with a government organisation, they felt actually we can have a much larger degree of tolerance with regards to that. So we can plot them on the grid and then we can say, right, what do we want to do about these? How tightly do we need to control those areas of risk? And once we've had that conversation, we then say, but hang on a second, the world is changing. And we did this exercise back in April. And what we wanted to do was say, okay, so this is where all of our objectives plotted, say in January 2020. But the world has changed. We have this thing called COVID-19. And so how has that been impacting on our ability to achieve those objectives given the zone of tolerance that we've assessed? Okay, so by inducing or by putting in a zone of tolerance, it means that the organization can have some shocks, but COVID-19 is quite special because it's pushed a lot of organizations outside of their tolerance zone, either knowingly or unknowingly. So in this particular example here, let's just suggest that due to COVID-19, some specialists might not be able to get to their place of work. Has this been a common occurrence across the world? Oh yes, of course it has. You don't have to have been in the UK to have been experiencing this particular issue. If we drill down into this particular example, let's just assume that this specialist is an electrician or an electrical engineer, and one of the jobs that they should be doing is testing all of your electrical appliances to make sure that they're not faulty. Okay, so this might be something that is important for just in a normal office, or it might be something that's important for one of the defence units, for example, that we may well have in the UK. So do we have those specialists in place? Can they get to their place of work? Can they undertake their jobs? Let's assume they couldn't, because they couldn't get to their place of work. So what this means is that appliance testing might not be undertaken. And so therefore, we might be leaving some of our high risk facilities exposed. Okay, because there are faulty bits of electrical equipment that are sitting inside those facilities. Nobody else is in those facilities, but the facilities themselves may be housing really important bits of kit that are important for us achieving our objectives. Let's let this scenario carry on. Okay, yes, there might be a faulty device due to a lack of budget over the last few years. The fire suppression system may not have been installed. Oh yes, and we might have some oxygen and we might have some fuel. What does that therefore add up to? Yes, that adds up to a potentially nasty fire. Okay, so we now have a fire, say in a hangar. So let's just imagine this is the Air Force, something like that. Okay, this may result in lots of aircraft being lost. Okay, so we've now lost some of our critical equipment that we need in order to be able to do our job. How does that then impact on our objectives? Well, it means that we now no longer can meet our operational commitments. So that, as either an objective or as a risk, depending on how you want to phrase it, gets pushed outside of the zone of tolerance. But because we've moved one of them, we've now impacted on all of our other objectives as well. So supporting global Britain, yes, that now gets pushed out of tolerance as well. And suddenly everything begins to unravel, because what we realize is all risks are interconnected. And as soon as you adjust something in that network, everything else can bounce around, and some things will stay in tolerance, some things will move outside of tolerance, depending on what's going on within that system. And of course, we can model all of that up. We can introduce additional stresses into the system. So something like economic pressure causes the tightening of budgets. I think that might be about to happen next year. I don't think that's necessarily really even a risk, because we're pretty certain about that happening. But what does that then mean? It now means that with the exception of safety, everything else has moved outside of your tolerance zone. Okay, so therefore we now have two options. We can either pump more time, money, and effort into trying to achieve those objectives and move them back into our tolerance zone again, or we can relax that tolerance zone and in part change some of those objectives. Okay, we can change some of those objectives. And that's how, again, we then begin to work out how do we allocate time and resources to the achievement of different objectives and the management of different risks, but also be able to pull together the network of risk concept into risk appetite and tolerance. So with that, I'm now going to go back to our little exercise that we did earlier, and tap back into Ellen again. Ellen, have we got something to share with everybody? Excellent, we do indeed, brilliant. So I'm just going to push through. I'm going to let Ellen either grab hold of the sharing or just leave it with me. It's up to her. Brilliant. Thank you very much, Ellen. So what we can see on Ellen's slide there are from your word clouds that we did, and we took, what, 5 minutes over that exercise. As a collective, we've begun to map out what does that best case, worst case, and most importantly, appetite and the capacity being that tipping point. How much risk are we willing to accept with regards to going back to the office? Now, of course, we all work for different organizations around the world, but imagine if you were doing this with your core team, okay, in your organization, so that everybody feels that they understand how much risk can we actually take in pursuit of our activities, and then be able to work out some of those metrics or those indicators that go with them. This is a very, very quick and easy exercise, which of course can be done virtually, just like we've done it now, or it works really well, of course, if you have posters and post-it notes. Everybody loves a little bit of that. It's a really great way of tackling big, difficult problems, or problems where lots of people have different perspectives with regards to what the risks truly are and how much risk is too much risk. By using appetite and tolerance, what you're doing is you take a very objective approach to understanding, okay, when we're talking about safety and we need to know what that tipping point is, how do we define that? How do we drill into something as emotive as having the potential to hurt somebody? How do we look at that? Because then we need to work out what the controls are, what our management actions are, to try and ensure that those risks that we face stay within that tolerance zone. Okay, if not, of course, meeting and exceeding our risk appetite. That's when everybody is really happy. So thank you very much for that, Ellen. That's absolutely fantastic. And yes, ladies and gentlemen, all of these slides that we're going through at the moment, these will be posted on our website and hopefully on the Understanding Risk website within the next few hours after we finish today's session. So if I just wrestle back controls again from the lovely Ellen, thank you very much for that work in the background, Ellen. That's fantastic. And what we're going to do in the last 5 minutes is say, okay, so hang on a second. For the last 40 minutes, we've been talking about networks and circles and appetite. And yes, I am quite hungry. You know, what is this again? And actually, how on earth do I do this simply with my team? Well, if you want to do it simply with your team, yes, of course, you can use this tool here, or an even simpler way of trying to ensure that people are managing their risks to within a tolerable level is to use something called an impact and action map. So this is just another way of prioritizing the risks that you may have identified in conjunction with a task or something that might be going on. And what you have here, and you can see it on the slide in front of you, is along your x-axis, you have the potential for that risk to impact on whatever it is you're trying to do. So normal impact, and you've just got lower to higher. And then up the y-axis, where yes, ordinarily you would have likelihood. We can have another discussion about likelihood later, but we get rid of likelihood and all the problems that come with likelihood, because there are many. And instead we say, with regards to this particular risk, do I need to take action? And by taking action, that usually means my controls aren't quite working yet, or I'm not happy with where that risk is sitting. And so what you have here is, if you have a risk that is up high on that axis, that indicates lots of action is needed. Whereas if you're sitting down below that tolerance line, you're saying actually no action is needed at all. We just need to maintain what we've got and keep an eye on the context to make sure it doesn't change and push some of those risks outside of that tolerance zone. So what you can see here on the map is, this is obviously a map portraying the Democratic Republic of Congo. And this is a country that some of our team have really been very privileged to spend quite a lot of time in over the last year. So yes, our French was vastly improved by spending lots of time here, working with some of the world's larger and perhaps more famous cobalt mines. So every single one of us who have one of these in our pocket, we are probably carrying around a bit of the DRC. And that cobalt comes from places that look a little bit like this on the picture in front of you. Now, when we were going to the DRC, we used this impact and action map to help us work out, okay, before we travel there, what sort of risks do we need to be aware of? There are some risks that if they happen, they will have a big impact on us, but there's nothing we can do about them, or there's nothing more that we want to do about them. And they would be plotted down below this little dashed line. There will be other risks, though, that will be high impact, and we will need to take lots of action in order to be able to manage them. And when we start plotting up all of these different risks, we then get a picture of, okay, is it actually possible to go to the DRC to do this work, or do I need to take lots of action to reduce all of those risks down below that tolerance level? Because only at that point in time is anybody traveling to the DRC. Okay, and we did this multiple times. This is a slightly scrappy version of one, to say, actually, is the team, or are the teams ready to go to the DRC? Okay, and what you've got here are the risks being plotted, and then in the blue post-it notes, these were controls that were being put in place, and gradually those risks would move down below the dotted line. Now, what we found happening was, we used this to determine, could we travel to the DRC or not? And the answer was, eventually, after a lot of work, we said, actually, yes, we can. We're going to go to the DRC, despite the fact that it is a high risk environment. And so multiple teams went to the DRC. And this was fine until that little thing called COVID hit. And one member of our team, because his passport had gone to the capital city in the DRC to get another visa, unfortunately, it was something that was totally out of our control. And actually, what we learned was, we were unaware that his passport wasn't in his pocket. So that was a situation where we were learning from incidents, but we found ourselves in a position where we had a team member who could not leave the country, despite the fact that all of the airports in Africa were shutting down and flights were being cancelled left, right, and centre. When that happens, some of these risks, which we had managed to a tolerable level, bounced up again, because the context had changed, and those controls with regards to, say, evacuation were no longer possible. So they were no longer effective. So those risks bounced up above the line. And so what Ellen and myself and a large number of the rest of the team spent at least 6 weeks doing, I think it was, Ellen, was trying to work out how do we solve this situation. And what we used were these impact against action maps to say, okay, what kind of scenarios might we face? Because when we wake up tomorrow, suddenly Ethiopian Airways may have stopped flying their planes for whatever reason, and they were the only airline that was actually flying in Africa for a good course of COVID-19 back towards May direction. So what if all of the flights stop entirely? Or what if the DRC does actually open its border? What if South Africa starts allowing foreign travelers to fly through Johannesburg again? What if all of these different scenarios? And as soon as we started doing that, we could work out different management options, and we could say, okay, so can we put that option in place, and can we better manage those risks? And the answer at the end of this was a fairly emotional 48-hour journey for our colleague who had been stuck in the DRC, during which I can't remember how many plane flights or different journeys he took, but eventually he did manage to get back to France, which was his home destination. But that was after a very long period of very changing context, despite the various insurance policies, etc., that we'd taken out with very expensive organizations. None of them worked because nobody really was prepared for the scale of COVID-19. But what this meant was that by looking at all of our options and constantly reevaluating them every day, and it took about 2 minutes to move those risks around with regards to their post-it notes, we were able to evacuate our colleague from an environment that was getting worse and worse every day. So the reason why we show you this is, yes, when you're doing risk appetite and tolerance, you can use a tool like this, and you can begin to drill down into those metrics, and you can have things that are really well planned and good for understanding across your organization what might be needed, and the alignment with regards to how much risk is too much risk. Or you can use something super complicated, super simple, I should say, which is your impact against action map. And this we find to be such a powerful tool with regards to enabling people to not only prioritize their risks, but also use it as a dashboard to see, are we managing our risks in a very changeable environment? So with that, ladies and gentlemen, I think our time is pretty much up. In summary, risk appetite means how much risk are you willing to take? So that is the international definition that is used by most businesses with regards to what is meant by risk appetite. Risk tolerance is all about how much risk can you take? How much risk can you take? The reason why we use risk appetite and tolerance really is to set expectations with regards to our teams and align our teams, especially in times of crisis or change, and or it is in times of peace so that we are ready for those times of change. And finally, it should be something that is flexible and dynamic, because I guarantee you, as soon as you have published internally your risk appetite and tolerance, something will change and it will be out of date. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to say thank you very much for joining us here today, no matter where you are in the world. Thank you for taking part in our little exercises that we've got. All of this information will be published on our own blog, but it will also be published on the conference website, we hope, as well. If you've got questions, comments, ideas, please feel free to email either myself or any member of our team. And hopefully we look forward to engaging with you, be it virtually or in person, which would be amazing, at some point in time in the near future. Thank you very much, everybody, and hope to see you soon.